Good afternoon. I'm Randy Horton on behalf of myself and Bernhard Kappa from Orthogonal and Buddy Smith from MedSec. We want to welcome you. We're excited to see a lot of people here today. This good turnout. We consistently get good turnouts for these. We appreciate you taking an hour out of your day to spend with us on this. We don't take that for granted, and we're going to try and really give you maximum value and pack, at least 4 hours worth of good content into an hour or less. That's the goal. So today we're talking about meeting FDA requirements for BLE and mobile medical apps, specifically connecting smartphone apps for medical devices with proprietary medical devices using Bluetooth. A little background, as many of you know, Orthogonal, we do about a webinar a month to convene industry experts from device makers and other product and service firms. Our goal is to share best practices so that we can all accelerate improving patient outcomes faster. Today is part of a series we've been doing for several months jointly with our partners at MedSec around using Bluetooth with FDA-regulated devices. Originally, some of you may have noticed the title was around FDA requirements for testing Bluetooth. As we got into it and started doing some interviews with people for background on this, we realized that we will cover testing, but we're going to cover a broader set of issues also, that testing was a little too narrow of a topic. So I guess you'll get that plus more. We have, we'll chat out to everybody the link where you can see about past webinars and blogs and upcoming webinars on this. Two interesting blogs we did recently. One looked at some Bluetooth-enabled devices that have been approved this year by the FDA. Another one was a bit of a trip down memory lane from the early 2000s, looking at some of the very first medical devices that were approved with Bluetooth, which is interesting to see. I feel like a broken record because I've now had several webinars where I said this is the second to last webinar in the series. It's not. We keep thinking of more topics and getting more topics requested, but we will wrap this by the end of the year. So just a quick preview. On October 25th, we're going to do a webinar together with MedSec and also our partners from Blur, who's a product design and development firm, talking about when you're doing Bluetooth on two sides, from the smartphone, mobile app side, and the proprietary hardware side. How do you get those two teams who are in sort of two different, very different technology stacks to effectively collaborate and make design decisions so that these things work well, which is not necessarily an easy thing, we found. And then the final one in this series is November 8th. We got a very special guest, Ketil Halsted, who's the Executive Vice President for Strategy and Product Management at Nordic Semiconductor. For those of you not familiar with Nordic, they are really in the top tier of manufacturers of wireless chips for Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, and other protocols. Our whole series to date has been around how do you use Bluetooth today? We thought it'd be interesting to talk to somebody who's really at the forefront of where wireless is going to ask the question, okay, if you're a medical device maker and you're starting to think about what will my devices be able to do and what will the opportunities be in 5 or 10 years out, what's happening with wireless? We thought this is a good opportunity to bring somebody in who's really thinking about those questions to talk about, as device developers, how do we plan a little further down the road and start to put things in our roadmap? Okay. We will be posting the webinar on YouTube, and we'll have a blog out in a day or so. We'll have a summary of the blog out a week or two later. Please send us your ideas. Our goal for you today, I said, pack 4 hours of content into an hour, have an interesting and timely discussion, and hopefully you'll walk away with at least a few gold nuggets. Today's format is primarily going to be a presentation, but we got a bunch of questions from people ahead of time, and please submit your questions in here, and we'll really try and intersperse them and take them throughout. Bernard's going to be doing the primary presentation, but Buddy may join in and is certainly encouraged to join in on things, Buddy, with additional points. Or if you want to do like the old family feud, if you disagree, be like survey says, you're welcome to do that as well to liven it up. So like we said, Bernhard will be going from now till about 12:50 Eastern, so 50 after the hour. And we'll be done. You can leave at that point. We'll have taken a couple questions by then, but we will be able to stay about another 20 minutes or so if there are more questions we still haven't answered. And generally, we find about 40% of the people stay well past the hour till when we sort of run out of questions or run out of time. So send in your questions. And with that, I'm going to turn it over. Actually, Buddy, let me ask you to introduce yourself and just a few sentences about MedSec before we jump in.
Sure. Hey guys, my name's Buddy. I'm part of the technical leadership team here at MedSec. My focus is penetration testing for medical devices on behalf of mobile medical device manufacturers. We do a full range of security and regulatory services for MDMs. So we work with regulatory filings, we create threat models, we do penetration testing, as well as general consulting and guidance. So happy to be here today.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for the partnership. Bernhard, I'm going to turn it over to you. And if I could ask if you could just do like 3 lines about yourself and Orthogonal and then dive into the content.
Yeah, so I'm Bernhard Kappa. I'm founder and CEO of Orthogonal. Found my way into the medical device business about 12, 15 years ago. Our company Orthogonal builds solutions for connected medical devices, a lot of Bluetooth, mobile apps, cloud, AI algorithms. We apply modern methods, fast feedback loops, agile test automation, et cetera, as well as kind of well-engineered quality management systems and ALM solutions to drive faster releases and faster innovation for medical device startups and large companies. I'm going to go into slideshow mode here. Hopefully people can see my screen. All right. So as Randy had mentioned, we have a whole set of these presentations. There's a white paper on the way and a lot of blog posts. So certainly, take a look at our website at orthogonal.io, where we have a lot of this information, and sign up for the newsletter as well. So the topic is Bluetooth and the FDA. So a lot of you probably know this, but not everyone has FDA knowledge and experience. So I'm going to do the sort of super high level, right? The FDA's mandate is to foster safety and innovation for medical devices, or at least CDRH, the medical device portion of the FDA has that mandate. And they will review different types of products. There's sort of 3 types of FDA submissions. There's PMAs, which is for high-risk devices. And, once you submit something, typically you need clinical evidence, but if you are going to make changes to that, most of the changes you're going to make require approval. And there's absolutely, because of the high risk, more scrutiny around that. Then there are de novo, which is there is no existing category for something. And so, when you're very often when you're doing something innovative, you end up in a de novo pathway. They then create a new device category on that, and that sets a precedent for 510Ks. Once that new category is there, other people can do 510Ks based on that. You can as well. And 510K is a process where you are saying that you have substantial equivalence to another device that is been cleared, and provide evidence that it's safe, effective, and equivalent to that. So if we look at kind of some more of the basics, right? One of the most important things that you need to do here is to have design controls on your device and on your software. You want to appropriately control your risks and ensure effectiveness. In general, the riskier the device is, the more you need to do to reduce those risks to acceptable levels and to demonstrate effectiveness of your risk controls. If you're doing something new or pushing the envelope, the FDA in general is going to be cautious, right? Remember, part of that process is setting precedent. If they open it up to you, then they're going to be opening it up to a whole bunch of other people. So they're very cautious about those things. The other thing is that the FDA sees a lot of devices. They see a lot of adverse event reporting. They see recalls. They also see when something goes on the market and there are no issues for that category. So if they don't see problems, maybe initially they have a higher burden, but then they will reduce that. But then if they do see issues, they may issue new guidance or otherwise have greater scrutiny on this. An example of this from, say, I want to say 10, 12 years ago, one of the first companies that had a mobile app connected to a glucometer, when they actually submitted to the FDA asked them to go back and do a human factor study to show whether that people could easily go to the app store and then download the application. Again, this was an issue 12 years ago. Pretty soon they stopped doing that, right? It's like, no, people don't have problems with it. But if you are doing something new, you may get something that later on they decide not to necessarily do. The FDA has a limited number of reviewers and they see lots and lots of different things. There's not always technical expertise on every team, or it's unevenly distributed. And so you may get different interpretations of the guidance and the standards. You may get different types of technical questions based on other experience that they've had. You don't know what you're going to get with your reviewers. Generally, you're going to get some outliers, but your strategy is probably looking towards that kind of, middle of the bell curve in terms of the people that you are likely to get. But there's always going to a chance of something unanticipated happening in your review process. So if we look at Bluetooth and BYOD, I tend to look at this in terms of like risk and complexity, right? If you're doing something that's low risk and low complexity, probably there's not going to be very much scrutiny on it, right? So let's say you have a pulse oximeter, it's a single measure you're connecting, it's unidirectional communication, we're just getting data off of there, and you have mobile device management. In other words, it's not BYOD, it's you are totally controlling everything on the smartphone, and this is a 510K. This thing is pretty low risk. You're not going to get a whole lot of scrutiny on that. You obviously need to do best practices, et cetera, but the bar in terms of sort of risk reward for this is a lot lower than it can be for other things. On the other end of the spectrum, if what you're doing is connecting to a high risk device, so CGM, infusion pump, pacemaker, all of these types of things, that's a much higher bar. If you're trying to get continuous real-time data in the background, again, for something like that, again, a higher bar. You're actually controlling those devices and controlling therapy using your smartphone. Okay, again, the bar gets higher. You have an AI algorithm in the smartphone or on the cloud that uses data from the smartphone and from the device to actually then automatically change the therapy. Again, a higher bar. Patient-facing, that actually should be patient-facing. That's another set of things that you need to consider. Those people are not going to have the training that you might be able to provide to clinicians. They don't have the same expertise and experience. So you're going to have additional things, certainly a lot more human factors that you have to consider. If it's BYOD, again, that's going to be another thing. So in other words, if the patients or the users are providing their own smartphones, there are all kinds of other things on there in terms of software updates and in terms of configuration, in terms of other applications that are on there. Also, all of the different variability in terms of operating system, hardware, et cetera, that you're going to have in a BYOD environment. And then again, for some of these high risk things, in the case of the pulse ox, chances are if it's not available, you're not causing any harm. But in the case of, control of an infusion pump or something like that, or say a CGM with alerts where unavailability may cause harm, again, there's a higher burden there, and there's some considerations there, in particular with Bluetooth, where you have to really tighten things up. Interoperability, SDKs, where your SDK for your device and app is part of someone else's application integrated in, those are other things that, add to the complexity. So, it can be really straightforward and easy. It can be very challenging on the other end in terms of this. In one of the webinars we did a little earlier, we kind of looked at the evolution around Bluetooth connectivity in the nerve stimulator space. So where initially, there was a dedicated device using not Bluetooth as a band, then the next competitor provided an iPhone and iPad interface via Bluetooth, but with a locked down system. And then another one went and said, oh, we're now going to do BYOD for this, and we're going to have an AI algorithm for suggesting new therapies, and we're going to be able to set things into MRI safe mode. So that's a progression that has happened, in many parts of the industry, where more and more functionality is moving from the device onto the smartphone, and again, more features, more value, but also a lot more complexity. In this case, other folks other than Nevro, who we have pictured here for the last one, have also done that. And just about 2 months ago, there was a recall. So on July 18th, this is from the FDA site, Abbott Medical recalls Proclaim and Infinity IPGs for inability to exit MRI mode. So class 1 recall, most serious type of recall. You can read all about it on the FDA website. If you look at the details of that recall, right, there are a couple of parts, right? There's the IPG, which is an implant. It's headless. There is no external direct interface to that. It's implanted and connects to the spinal cord. And there's a patient controller app, and there's also a programmer app. So PC here means patient controller. And there were a number of instances where basically the patient controller lost the ability to connect with the IPG while in MRI mode. So MRI mode in this case means, you have set this into a mode where it's safe to go through an MRI. You're not really able to do any nerve stimulation therapy during that time, but you won't have any damage to your spinal cord because of the MRI machine's interaction with the electrical stimulator. But when you go out, you want to turn it out of MRI safe mode. And so here, there are what we would generally consider edge cases that happen. So either the operating system was updated in a BYOD setting. You don't necessarily have control over that. Or the patient controller was updated or deleted, in this sequence. And or the IPG was deleted from the list of available Bluetooth devices. So all of these things are kind of edge cases that you need to deal with and figure out as part of that. And clearly there were a number of instances where that was not gracefully handled here. And in fact, there were 186 reported incidents and 73 reported injuries. and no reported death as part of that. So this is something that, when we think about how the FDA looks at things, right? You keep going and you keep going, and then something happens. I expect this whole category to have a whole set of new questions, right? Even other ones that are in market. How have you dealt with this? Inspections would be, these kinds of things would be top of mind as part of this. We talk to a lot of people, our clients, various folks in the industry. We've also talked to folks at the FDA about this in preparation to the webinar. And one of the trends that we've seen for high-risk devices up until, very recently, more and more functionality for high-risk devices was getting pushed out onto the smartphone in a BYOD environment. And that trend for complexity, I think, is because of some of these things getting a little bit of a pause. It can be really hard to actually maintain appropriate design controls in a BYOD environment. I'd say for the vast majority of devices, it's not a big issue, but for high-risk devices like this, actually managing those attack surfaces is really difficult. So folks are, in some cases, rethinking their strategy, going back to mobile device management rather than BYOD for high-risk devices.
Bernhard, we had somebody who jumped in and asked, what is BYOD? So maybe you could explain both the acronym, a little bit about why it's an issue for those who don't know.
Yeah. BYOD in this case means bring your own device, right? So in this case, not bring your own medical device, but bring your own smartphone. So, practically everyone has a smartphone in their pocket. Rather than giving someone a second smartphone that is dedicated, which costs money and is very often inconvenient, BYOD means you have your app on the patient's smartphone, connecting to your device. The challenges around this are obviously you don't have everything under your control, right? Apple, Samsung, Google, etc., are updating and making changes to their operating system. Sometimes that happens, very frequently. Sometimes there are patches, etc. And then other apps as well on the smartphone are being updated as well. So that's one of the challenging aspects. The other part is there is different hardware and there are different operating systems that you are dealing with. And in some cases, such as with BLE or use of the camera, those could have a significant impact, and you may need to think about what your strategy is for minimizing those risks and or testing for those risks. So there's a lot of questions to consider as part of this. Questions you may get asked by the FDA. Cybersecurity is one of those, and we're going to talk about that in a fair bit more detail a little bit later. But again, usability is one of those things. If the phone is not locked down and you don't necessarily control all of the OS level messaging and what is allowed and available or not. So things like, critical alerts, you can set up mute buttons, do not disturb, etc. Can the average consumer figure out, or a 60 to 70-year-old figure out exactly what the settings that you need on the smartphone that you can't control, that you need them to make changes to? Other things to think about are, anytime you are leveraging sensors on the phone, do you really need those? In some cases, absolutely, you need the camera, you need the accelerometer, you need various things like that, but not always, right? Each of these things, depending on the criticality, are other things you need to test for and figure out whether they meet your needs and what risks they could introduce. If there are issues, can you detect if there's an issue? Can you detect what else is running and how it might be impacting what you're doing? Those are things when you are, again, especially the higher the risk you're going towards, that you really need to deal with. And then things will break in some fashion. You need to figure out what your strategy is for fixing things, right? What is a slower fix? How slow is that? What things do you need to fix quickly? How do you deal with those things? Can you disable functionality? Or do you need to basically, disable everything? The cybersecurity guidance that the FDA has put out is actually quite helpful here in terms of kind of the risk reward, especially for cybersecurity fixes, that the FDA is mindful that you probably want to get those fixes out pretty quickly. So a more streamlined approach to doing that. So cybersecurity, it's a big point of emphasis for the FDA. There have been, multiple revisions of pre and post-market guidance. Cybersecurity threats in general keep increasing as we live in a more and more connected world. And the FDA is certainly, really looking at this and also sees an awful lot of things. In this space, what folks at the FDA have told us is that the multiple function device guidance that is out there is a real workhorse for them. On the one hand, it provides boundaries for patient risk and non-device functions, especially in a smartphone where you can sort of say, okay, we don't need to test everything on the smartphone. Not everything in our application is necessarily a device, and we can gracefully manage those things, and there's good guidance around that in there and good examples as well. But for cybersecurity, it also says you don't just have to think about your device on its own. You have to think about it as part of the entire system and the ecosystem. So if your device is connected to a smartphone and it can control that, you can't just say, I just care about my device. No, you have to care about that app. And if that app is connected to the cloud or other services on the smartphone that maybe are shared with other applications, these are things that you need to take into consideration. So it means cybersecurity in many cases is a bigger deal than it is for patient safety. I'm not sure the FDA would necessarily agree with that, but based on my reading of the guidance and what we've heard, I think that's the case. Buddy, anything to comment on this?
One thing I would add is that as of October, the FDA has statutory authority to regulate cybersecurity in medical devices. So they are going to be looking at security a lot more closely, and they will be refusing to accept filings that they believe don't have sufficient cybersecurity documentation. So this is a really big change in the industry. It's kind of been the de facto standard for a while, but now it will be legally enforced. So if you're working on a new medical device today, you absolutely will need cybersecurity documentation, including a threat model, penetration tests, and all that good stuff.
Yeah, so more of a stick, explicit stick here. That's a good point. And absolutely, yes. It just shows more how seriously the FDA is taking this, and as well as Congress as well. So,
and we're also expecting a finalized version of the FDA draft guidance in the near future. So keep an eye out for that.
Yeah. So when I asked someone at the FDA in a recent conversation, sort of as a regulatory professional, what should you be doing when you're when you're working with your development teams, et cetera? on Bluetooth connectivity, and it's like, just go around the floor and ask people, point to things and say, we don't trust this, right? And if you just do that and have that as a conversation starter, one of the things I think a lot of people do is assume that things are already safe, and that is as we see from various things, is not really the case. So I have that image in my head. So think about that as well. If you use that as a mantra, then I think you're kind of part of the way there to where you need to be in terms of thinking about cybersecurity. So, a few things in particular there is like, really don't assume Bluetooth is secure. You're going to run into new threats. Things are going to happen. If you just rely on Bluetooth for the security, you're going to have some problems. So really think about security more comprehensively. Have security outside of just the Bluetooth layer, encryption at rest and encryption in transit, out of bounds pairing, data communication over the interface, all kinds of things that you can do outside of purely the Bluetooth protocol in order to ensure security. Another important thing here is detecting jailbroken phones, right? Whether that's done directly by the user or maliciously. This is something you should have as part of your app security for sure. And then you need to think about, based on the risk of that you might have here, how the use needs to change in that circumstances. Do you completely deny access? Do you just notify them of this, or do you say, well, we're going to allow this specific functionality, but not this until this is fixed? Again, depends on your device and kind of the what the implications of not being able to use this are versus the cybersecurity risks around that. Again, for higher risk medical devices, thinking about controlling for third-party apps is important. Do they use the same services? Do they use Bluetooth? Do they change the configurations and settings? Are they updated, right? What are the security holes in these other things? A classic example here is using the browser. If you're using the Chrome browser, let's say on the smartphone, even on an iPhone, let's say, have they updated the Chrome browser? There's lots of security holes around that. So it's can be a real challenge, obviously, in a BYOD environment. Not so much of a challenge in MDM because you have full control over what is on that smartphone if it's under your MDM. Again, what are the sensors that you need on the phone, and then SDK integration with other apps, right? And we see a lot of that where let's say you're a CGM, you're connecting that into some other application, or point of care diagnostics integrated into telemedicine applications. That can be a high bar from a security perspective because, again, the question is, who is in charge of security for that? If your SDK is integrated into someone else's application and you're connecting via Bluetooth, but you're also connecting potentially to your interoperator services or your own services on the back end. So how do you do security certificate sharing? You need to work that out, plus the legal. How do you ensure trusted communication? In many cases, it can be really beneficial for certain types of things to have SDKs to unlock a larger market and build out your ecosystem. But there are a lot of challenges there that you need to think about as part of that. Before we go to scoping analysis and testing, Buddy, other things you would add here?
Yeah, I think the important thing to think about with Bluetooth Low Energy or Bluetooth is to treat it like any other communications link. Like you said, don't trust it. Don't trust the data going over it, or as we say, trust but verify. One of the biggest controls that can help is the addition of an application layer encryption protocol on top of the Bluetooth link encryption. And that way you have some ability to make sure that the device knows it's talking to your application and not another application on the device.
Yep. Yeah. And out of band pairing and things like that as well. Exactly. Lots of emphasis on those types of things.
We had a couple questions that came in from this section. One, somebody asked, Buddy, in reference to your thing about the FDA now having a regulatory authority, is that going to slow things down for people submitting applications?
I would say hopefully not, but it does mean that they're going to be looking at the filing closely, especially with respect to security. So if you get questions back from the FDA, or they ask for more information, then that could slow things down because you'll have to respond to those questions or potentially make changes before you get approval. So you could definitely see some slowdowns there if they don't feel that your security is sufficient for the device that you're making.
Yeah. So again, this may be the kind of thing where you ask some more security related questions in your pre-subs if that's what you're doing. It'll be interesting to see, but it's already been, cybersecurity. It's not like cybersecurity was not being asked about, but I'm sure there's going to be additional training for reviewers and inspectors on this. So whenever there is new training, these kinds of things end up being top of mind. So be prepared is what I would say, right?
Great.
So obviously, part of what you need to do is verify your that you have good security controls, right? And or for your claims as well, and how your device is supposed to work. So, what the FDA has told us really is operate on the worst case scenarios. And, from talking to lots of device manufacturers as well, if you're testing, test on the most outdated phone that you support and a most outdated operating system you support. The FDA is not going to look kindly on something where you say, we support all iPhones and all Android, and you only tested on the latest iPhone and the latest Samsung. And then, if you're saying, hey, we can connect and it'll work up to 10 feet out, don't test to 10 feet, test to 20 feet, right? So, give yourself some cushion and in terms of the claims that you are making. Definitely, you need to think about this both in terms of hardware environment and software. So, we've dealt a lot with implanted devices. So if you have a device in the body and a smartphone is in a case in the back pocket, is it supposed to work? Well, you can test with, saline solution. You can test with certain types of mannequins for this as well. Those are some of the types of testing that you might need to do for again, higher risk devices that are implanted. You want to, if it's in home use, create RF interference and test things like baby monitors, which may be really polluting in the environment, microwaves, etc. What is a typical home environment actually like? Those are the kinds of things you'd want to test. And similarly, in a clinical setting, you'd want to look at those things as well. And again, if you have enough patient risk here, put some code in there to see where things fall apart and collect data for operational diagnostics. At least for when you're doing internal testing. You may not be able to have that in your production applications, although in some cases you might. Part of the effort here is actually not purely just test everything. I think that was the strategy that some folks had early on, but a lot of this is sort of intelligent scoping of what you need to test for and what the differences are. So, with smartphones and Bluetooth, what are the chipsets that are being used and the manufacture of those for Bluetooth? If you have the same chip manufacturer, you may have more confidence and be able to sort of limit your testing strategy a little bit more to just changes there. And then similarly with your threat modeling, you have to treat it as a system. And also, as I think Buddy and I were talking about this the other day, do you want to talk a little bit about the pen testing side of this?
Yeah, one thing that we've seen repeatedly from the FDA is that your penetration test should be recent. So if you haven't had a penetration test within 12 months of your device and application, and you're about to do regulatory filing, you definitely want to get ahead of that. And they want to make sure that it's a complete end-to-end test of the entire system. So you don't want to test your medical device and then test your application without the device on hand. So you really want to make sure that you're testing the entire system when you do a penetration test.
Makes sense. So again, if you're doing something new and innovative, you may be asked to do something that others later won't be asked to do, right? I shared the example earlier of human factors testing for seeing whether someone would be able to download an application from the App Store. That was probably a one-time thing, and after that human factors study came through, they never asked it again. But if you're doing something new, you might get asked for a lot of things. But over time, it's an interesting balance you have to strike in terms of how much analysis and how much testing you are doing and are sort of sharing with the FDA. Because if you establish something and you're extremely rigorous, and obviously there's a cost to doing all of these things, it's very hard to go back from that. So part of what you have to do is sort of strike a balance here, and then also negotiate some of this with the FDA, right? So you want to absolutely be safe, but you want to be smart about that safety. So more scoping, more analysis means likely you may not need to do as much testing. The thing that I think we have seen with the FDA is, again, when they get more experience around certain things, it is possible to come back, especially if you come with evidence that correlates to what they're seeing in the market. You can potentially negotiate a change and say, look, we haven't seen anything, you haven't seen anything. We're not going to do this level of testing on here, but we're going to increase testing somewhere else. There is absolutely a cost to doing a lot of this monitoring and testing. So in some cases, it may be worth having those conversations after the fact with the FDA. One of the things that came across, around a lot of this testing and analysis was, yes, the FDA cares about this, but there are other reasons why you need to or want to do that. And patient satisfaction is one of the biggest ones, right? In many cases, leading to more desire to do very rigorous testing and managing of edge cases, especially for lower risk devices. Expectations for patients for all of this is that it just works. And so you're not going to get high satisfaction without high reliability. there are challenges here. You can't always reproduce all those the problems that are out there. But to the extent that you have monitoring on there, you can probably look at those things better and then bring those back in, as we talked in previous webinars about edge cases and building out a library of edge cases and ways of managing those edge cases is really important, right? But the biggest gripe is typically that an app that was supposed to be working in background mode gets killed and doesn't give you information. You were relying on something alerting you overnight, and there was an OS update that killed your application, right? Apple does housekeeping, some other vendors do as well, that kill background processes. That's probably the most prevalent one that is out there that you really have to manage as part of the process.
Yep. Bernard?
Yeah.
One point that somebody made who would talk to us about that, I just want to throw in, is they said, you absolutely need to satisfy the FDA's requirements and your own concerns about safety. You don't have to report in as part of your filing every single test you do to make sure that the patient experience is as good as possible. In fact, you probably don't want to, because if you decide something isn't useful or whatever, you don't want to be bound by it in the future.
Yes, exactly. I think that's a great point. Test as much as you need to for patient satisfaction and for effectiveness, but yes, don't share all of it, but be very judicious in terms of what you share with the FDA, because it will set expectations. There are a couple of other things that we found that were interesting that I think speak to where we are right now. We're not in the days right now where there's one app and one device out there. There's lots and lots of them, and actually many patients have comorbidities, and many of them have devices and apps for those different diseases. So diabetes, COPD, heart conditions, blah blah blah. All of these things there are comorbidities between them, and if you have a high risk device, one of the things that you need to think about is, what is your strategy for updates, both OS updates, your own app updates, and what the OS does for updating all applications or not, right? And so there's settings that you can have in the operating system for these things. And what we've seen, and what the FDA has seen, is that for different conditions where there are comorbidities, there are different instructions and different strategies by the smartphone, by the medical device manufacturers on allow updates, force updates, et cetera, et cetera. And that even happens with applications from the same medical device manufacturer. I won't name them, but very large multi-line companies that have devices and applications for those different comorbidities, very often are not necessarily communicating between those different groups, and don't necessarily have a common strategy around that. So if you are with one of these large companies, this might be something you want to coordinate on. It is absolutely something that is on the FDA's radar now. Almost wrapped up here, but obviously there are other regulations that you may want to look at depending on what markets you're looking at. We don't have time for all of that, but DoD, VA, the Office of Management and Budget, absolutely FCC, or if you are doing something that may be on an airplane, FAA, or if your device is actually, or the device smartphone combination is used by clinicians in their work environment in the hospital, we've seen OSHA also being something that you've had to deal with. So last thing here is kind of the biggest mistakes that, we asked the FDA, we asked various people compiled that people doing Bluetooth connected devices with smartphones have. So, the number one mistake here is really everything everywhere all at once. So basically you folks having a regulatory filing that is, not incremental, that sort of is super innovative, introduces lots new risks. And what the FDA is going to do in a circumstance like that is ask you for lots and lots of data, and once they get that data, ask for more data, and you're going to spend a very long time in the process of getting clearance or approval. In general, having an incremental strategy where you say, well, we're not going to make all of these claims. We're going to make this smaller subset of claims. It's lower risk, and then sort of add to that with additional filings later on. So it turns out, while that is not a fast strategy, it is much faster and much less expensive than the everything everywhere all at once strategy. As Buddy mentioned, pen testing app and device separately, you'll get rejections on that. You need to test as a system. Just relying on Bluetooth security is not enough. Just testing the latest and best case and not testing edge cases. Those are other, places either where you will end up with questions, rejections, etc., or you will end up with recalls as well. And the last one is too much testing, not enough analysis, right? So really just testing blindly, but not really scoping it well. I think you can get by in many cases with somewhat less testing, but having good scoping, good analysis, and good mitigations, and a good, clear story as to why that is the best and both and least burdensome approach for that. I think we're ready for some questions. Buddy, do you want to have anything to add before we get there?
No, I think we should dig into the questions. There's some good ones out there.
Let's do it. I'm going to stop sharing.
Buddy, you want to read them off?
One question that came in anonymously was, do we have to update the FDA every time we make a software update? And the answer to that is generally if the update is just for security. So if there's a cybersecurity vulnerability in the application that you're updating, you do not have to do a regulatory filing and get permission to distribute that update. It also may depend on whether you're in the context of a Bluetooth device, your application itself may or may not be considered part of the medical device. If your application is not part of the medical device, you have a little bit more leeway. And I think another part of that question, or a similar question, was if
Buddy, let me add to that, right? So there is absolutely guidance that the FDA has on when you need to file and when you don't need to file for software changes, right? And so that's pretty well understood, and I would absolutely go look at the guidance on that. Typically it's patient risk related in terms of those filings. It also depends on, is this a is it a 510K? Is it a PMA? There's more a higher bar in terms of when it's just a letter to file for PMA than it is for 510K. It's also changing somewhat in that the FDA now has authority to have predetermined change control plans. Primarily, I think most predetermined change control plans right now are AI algorithm related, but we do know of some folks that have applied predetermined change control plans to software outside of AI and gotten the FDA to buy off on that. So there is more than just the software guidance. There's other things like PCCP that may allow you to sort of reduce the number of clearances that you actually need.
So I hope that answered the question. If not, feel free to put another question in the chat. William has a question that I think, Bernard, you may be able to answer better, which is, with the BYOD, are there any electrical safety and EMC requirements? I don't know about the FDA stance on that, and I'm wearing my security hat, but that might be something you guys can answer.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, those are, the FCC requirements are there. And so those are the case both for your device, but then also for the smartphones. But those smartphones are generally going through their own FCC testing, right? So I don't think you need to repeat the FCC testing on the smartphones themselves. I think there are things in terms of your Bluetooth protocol that maybe not the FDA, but certainly if it's going to be used in a hospital environment, how noisy is your protocol is something that may get asked, certainly by large, sophisticated hospital systems, not necessarily by a local community hospital.
So for a penetration test for end-to-end system, what would the scope of testing be for a device that transfers data to a mobile app via Wi-Fi and then transfers data to the cloud via Bluetooth? I think that might be a little bit backwards. Maybe it talks to the device over Bluetooth and the cloud over Wi-Fi or over 5G. So in that case, I would consider the scope of the penetration test should be the device, the mobile application, as well as the cloud backend and any sort of portals or things that allow access to that cloud environment. So if there's a web app for, say, the patient's doctor to log in and send a message down to the device, that should also be in scope of your test. So generally, anything that is part of the system should be part of your penetration test. And a good way to help when you're working with a penetration testing firm like MedSec is to provide the instructions for use, as well as the threat model, and really provide as much as you can so they know from the start to finish who all interacts with this device and where those interactions are, and make sure you include all of those interactions in scope.
There's one here, I think, from Siddharth Ganesh. Question was, any tips to keep the app awake while collecting data in the background? So collecting and uploading data in low power mode, etc., where situations where the app is killed. I think we talked about this a lot in one of the previous webinars in terms of edge cases. You should not rely on something living in background mode, completely, right? It's there is going to be housekeeping by the OS, so you should expect this to stop working at some point. There are some things you can do, certainly to prompt people to open the application back up. As soon as you open the application back up in foreground mode, it will work again in background mode. The other things you can do are certainly, if you are connected to the cloud, you can listen to see, am I getting data? Is this working? And then from the cloud, you can push down notifications to the smartphone. but that has its own issues. If you get on an airplane and you are in airplane mode, you're not going to be getting data over the cloud. So you want to be very careful in terms of how you are messaging the end user as part of that. So there's no perfect solution in this case, especially since most people have the mobile phone as the central rather than the peripheral in the exchange.
Bernhard?
Yeah.
This will be fun. Someone took exception and said PCCP is only for AI ML and not regular software changes. This is where software design change come to guidance. I pointed out this mistake to FDA and they had to correct their E-star. If you know someone who got through PCCP with regular software, some reviewer messed up.
Interesting in that regard. If you so I don't know about that, because certainly they have gotten through that. They certainly pointed to the AI guidance, but I would say look directly at the statutory authority that was granted in the omnibus bill. That statutory authority is not limited to AI. That authority is more general for software changes. So it's a question of how the FDA interprets this, but there is nothing in their statutory authority that limits it to AI. So I disagree with you in that particular.
And in fact, we'll be publishing a white paper in about the next 48 hours addressing how to take advantage of that. Well, taking advantage of the fact that it doesn't restrict it. So
yeah,
happy to share offline.
Yeah, I would read the law that was signed that was the Fedora stuff in the omnibus bill. We had lots of people looking at that as part of that white paper as well from throughout the industry. What other questions do we want to answer here?
Mark has a question. For high-risk devices, do you think BLE can be used? And if so, what version do you recommend using? Pre 5.1 has some serious vulnerabilities. So I think one thing that I would say is if you're not using the very latest and greatest available Bluetooth standards and security standards, or you don't specify what versions you're supporting, you will get questions from the FDA on that. They do want you to use the latest available versions that you can. For high-risk devices, I think a lot of it depends on what the mobile application is doing. If it's performing life-supporting real-time control, then you're going to have a lot more scrutiny, which isn't to say that you can't do it, but you're going to have to do a lot more to make sure that it's safe and secure. And if the communication is jammed or disrupted, and that's not even just from security. If someone drops their phone in a lake, you don't want them to experience any harm. So even separate from the security aspects, you do need to think about the safety aspects.
Yeah, absolutely. I would totally agree with that. I think that's, again, what are you doing and not doing? If all you're doing is pulling data off and providing reporting to the patients or to clinicians rather than actually controlling, then chances are, you're not going to get as much scrutiny. You'll still get cybersecurity scrutiny because, it is still a potential attack surface, right? For the device itself. But otherwise, yeah, it's in general, we recommend going with the latest that you can. We actually publish a white paper on kind of the smartphone market for medical device connected medical devices, and monitor sort of what percentage of the market has Bluetooth 5.0 or 5.x, and it's a pretty rapid update process. You may not get 100% of the market, but you'll get, if you're starting now, within a year, you should expect, a lot more. And right now, there's no reason why at this point, unless you're trying to grab absolutely 100% of the market, that you should ever consider anything less than Bluetooth 5.
In the US and likely in Europe, you could take a
Yeah.
look at the numbers from Santia Mobile. That does not speak to other parts of the world.
Yeah, this is true. Yeah, but certainly for FDA, which is what we're talking about here today. So.
Okay, well, I think we're almost out of time. Any parting comments, buddy? I didn't know if your comment about you don't want a patient to suffer from harm if their cell phone drops in the lake. I'd like to point out they've already suffered harm if their cell phone drops in the lake. It's not a good day if that happens, even before you deal with medical issues.
Right.
Any final comments or points you all want to make on this before we will be posting the YouTube up? We will have a summary coming out. People ask for the slides. We will make a copy of the slides available as well. And finally, October 25th and November, I want to say 7th, hardware, software integration, and then what's basically the future of wireless for medical devices, November 8th. Any final comments from either of you guys?
Just one thing I don't think we've mentioned, I know we've talked on previous webinars, that one of the features that you really need in a medical device, especially if it's using Bluetooth or Bluetooth Low Energy, is the ability to update the firmware and software over the air. So if you haven't thought of that, or you're planning to make a device without a firmware update capability, you may experience some difficulties. So it's definitely something to plan ahead for.
Yep. Yeah, no, totally makes sense. And you know, the good news is in many cases, certainly the Bluetooth chip manufacturers have in some cases great SDKs for OTA update, and have considered a lot of the security things as part of that. So you know, not all of them do, but it's, you know, there's a pretty good model for that. One of the considerations there, actually, now that I think of that, is again for something where availability is important. You know, having some control over when that over-the-air update is happening for the firmware, right? Being able to schedule that and, you know, notify the end users of this as well.
Great. Well, thank you all for hanging in. I'd like to actually note that we well over 50% are still with us after the 1 hour mark. So we appreciate it. Send us your feedback and your questions. We look forward to talking to you or seeing you again on another webinar. Thanks. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone.